As we explore the entire history of the world, you'll learn why an ancient comb from thousands of years ago carries the very alphabet we still use today. You'll meet a brilliant thinker who figured out the size of our planet more than 2,000 years ago using nothing but shadows and geometry. And you'll discover how a handful of decisions made by kings, priests, and ordinary people ended up shaping the world you live in right now. So let's start our journey at the very beginning, with the first civilizations that rose up between two great rivers in what is now Iraq, where early city builders raised tall stepped towers at the heart of their towns, believing these structures brought them closer to the heavens. And inside these communities, priests studied the night sky with real dedication, mapping stars into shapes, tracking the movement of the moon, and using their observations to divide time into hours, minutes, and seconds, a system so effective that we still rely on it today. And it was these same clever Sumerians who also invented one of humanity's greatest tools, writing itself, allowing ideas, laws, and stories to survive long after the people who created them were gone. And it wasn't long before an ambitious king looked around at all these separate independent cities and thought there had to be a more efficient way to organize things. So he set out to unite them under a single rule, becoming the leader of what many consider the very first empire in history, proving that ambition and organization could reshape an entire region almost overnight. And while all this was happening in Mesopotamia, over in Egypt, monumental pyramids were rising from the desert sands, while across the sea on the island of Crete, the Minoans were creating beautiful, colorful artwork that still amazes historians today. And further east, in the Indus River Valley, an incredibly advanced society was quietly building organized cities with straight, planned roads and sophisticated drainage systems long before most of the world had anything close to that level of urban planning. And interestingly, they also left behind written records that remain a mystery to this day, since nobody has yet fully deciphered their language. And not long after, a ruler named Hammurabi carved a detailed set of laws into a massive stone pillar, creating one of the earliest legal codes in human history. A moment that inspired other ancient cultures to develop their own systems of law and governance, some of which spoke early languages that were surprisingly related to the English we use now. But for reasons historians still debate today, many of these powerful ancient civilizations began to weaken and collapse around the same period. And as bronze slowly went out of fashion, humanity entered a new era known as the Iron Age, a time of fresh tools, fresh weapons, and fresh possibilities. And around this same era, a man named Abraham had a son who became an ancestor of many people across Central Arabia, and another son who eventually had a family line leading to 12 sons, whose descendants became known as the Israelites, a group who later found themselves living in Egypt under harsh conditions, until a leader named Moses stood up and insisted that no one deserved to live in bondage, guiding his people out of Egypt toward a mountain where, according to tradition, they received a set of moral guidelines meant to shape their community for generations, and afterward, they settled in a new land, eventually coming under the rule of King David, who expanded their territory significantly, though he never managed to conquer the skilled seafaring Phoenicians, a people famous for sailing across the Mediterranean, founding new cities, and creating one of the most important inventions in human communication, a simple, elegant alphabet that used sounds instead of complicated pictures, a breakthrough so effective that neighboring cultures quickly adopted the idea for themselves. And evidence shows that this early alphabet was already being used more than 3,500 years ago, appearing even on small, everyday objects like an ancient lice comb, which tells us just how deeply writing had become part of daily life. And soon after, the powerful Assyrian Empire rose to dominance, conquering vast stretches of land, only to eventually be overtaken themselves by the Babylonians, who were later swept aside by the rise of Cyrus the Great, a leader whose rapid conquests reshaped the balance of power across the region entirely. And while all this political drama unfolded in the West, something completely different was happening far to the east, where a young prince named Siddhartha Gautama, deeply affected by witnessing human suffering, sickness, and death, gave up his royal comforts to search for a deeper understanding of life, eventually finding what he described as enlightenment after a long period of reflection, giving rise to a spiritual path that would influence millions of people for thousands of years. And if a different philosophy felt more appealing, there were plenty of options in ancient China, where Confucius encouraged people to treat one another with respect and to build strong, well-ordered societies, while Laozi taught a very different approach, encouraging people to embrace balance and flow naturally with life instead of forcing control over everything. And meanwhile, over in Greece, athletic competitions were being held every 4 years to honor their gods, laying the foundation for what we now know as the Olympic Games. But soon after, the people of Athens pioneered a bold new form of government known as democracy. Tensions rose sharply with the powerful Persian Empire, eventually leading to intense conflict, including a dramatic Athenian victory at the Battle of Marathon, a moment still remembered today. And following these events, a historian named Herodotus began carefully documenting these stories, helping lay the groundwork for the entire discipline of written history, while Greek thinkers pushed the boundaries of philosophy even further, with Socrates inspiring Plato, who in turn taught Aristotle, who eventually became the mentor of a young man who would go on to conquer much of the known world. Alexander the Great, whose military campaigns reshaped borders and cultures across 3 continents before his unexpectedly early death. And afterward, his most trusted generals split his vast empire among themselves, sparking new kingdoms and further conflict, while at the same time, brilliant minds in Egypt were making extraordinary scientific breakthroughs, including one remarkable individual who used shadows and basic geometry to calculate the size of the entire Earth with impressive accuracy. And while some rulers demonstrated genuine wisdom, others made questionable choices, leading to renewed tension when one particular Hellenistic king demanded that everyone in his kingdom worship him as a god, a demand that a determined Jewish community firmly refused, ultimately leading them to fight for and reclaim their independence. And soon after, powerful new forces began emerging on the world stage, as the Parthians expanded their control in the east, while the Romans steadily grew their influence in the west, eventually clashing with the seafaring Carthaginians, whose brilliant general famously crossed mountains with an army that included war elephants, delivering shocking defeats to Roman forces. Though Rome ultimately prevailed in the long run, and powerful Roman leaders such as Julius Caesar rose to prominence, expanding Roman territory even further, reforming the calendar system in the process, though it wasn't quite perfect, before internal political struggles led to further conflict, eventually resulting in Augustus Caesar becoming the very first Roman emperor, ushering in a new chapter for the empire. And during this period, a spiritual teacher named Jesus began sharing his message, ultimately facing execution by Roman authorities, though his followers later reported extraordinary events surrounding his death that sparked the rapid spread of a brand new faith, one that a former persecutor named Paul later became deeply devoted to spreading throughout the ancient world, despite facing serious hardship and resistance along the way, as Roman authorities grew increasingly uneasy about this expanding religious movement, leading to waves of persecution that, surprisingly, only seemed to strengthen its growth even further, until eventually a Roman leader named Constantine expressed newfound tolerance toward the faith, encouraging early religious leaders to gather and formally establish shared beliefs, a turning point that helped shape the direction of the religion for centuries to come. And not long after, the massive Roman Empire was divided into 2 separate halves, with the eastern portion continuing on as what historians now call the Byzantine Empire, while new powers such as the Sasanians rose in the east, and various groups migrated westward, eventually placing significant pressure on the Western Roman territories, ultimately contributing to major political and cultural transformations across the region. And meanwhile, in Asia, entirely different civilizations were forming their own unique identities, as early communities in what is now Vietnam and Cambodia developed distinct cultures, while skilled seafaring peoples spread from island to island across the Pacific, eventually settling incredibly distant locations including Madagascar, Hawaii, and New Zealand, showcasing remarkable navigational skill. And back in China, a long succession of powerful dynasties rose and fell over the centuries, each contributing groundbreaking innovations such as papermaking and early printing techniques that would eventually transform the entire world. And as Chinese influence expanded outward, various groups moved into Southeast Asia, forming new kingdoms and shaping the region's cultural landscape for generations. While in South Asia, several major developments were unfolding that would leave a lasting impact for centuries, including the spread of influential spiritual traditions, the unification of much of the subcontinent under powerful empires, and later, the flourishing of golden ages of art, science, and learning. Until new challenges and invasions once again reshaped the region's political landscape. And around this time, traders and teachers from South Asia began spreading their cultural and spiritual traditions throughout Southeast Asia, while similar ideas made their way into China, Korea, and Japan, setting the stage for a massive transformation that was about to unfold in the Arabian Peninsula, where a man named Mohammed began sharing a powerful new religious message, ultimately uniting historically divided Arab communities under the banner of Islam, a movement that rapidly expanded, establishing one of the largest empires the world had ever seen up to that point, eventually encountering resistance in Europe, particularly from the Frankish kingdom, whose leaders would later be honored by the Pope as rulers of what became known as the Holy Roman Empire, a political structure that endured for centuries. Even as portions of it eventually broke away to form separate kingdoms such as France, and around the same era, seafaring groups from Scandinavia began exploring and settling distant lands, establishing new communities and trade routes stretching from Russia to the British Isles, and even reaching as far as North America, demonstrating impressive navigational ambition long before most of the world believed such journeys were possible. And meanwhile, in Central Asia, various Turkic peoples formed powerful new states, with some eventually converting to Islam and expanding their territory significantly, creating friction with neighboring Byzantine forces, which eventually led religious leaders in Europe to call for a series of military campaigns known as the Crusades, resulting in prolonged conflict throughout the region before local rulers ultimately regained control. And not long after, a massive new power emerged from the steppes of Central Asia, as Mongol forces under a remarkable and highly skilled leader rapidly conquered enormous stretches of territory, creating one of the largest empires in human history, a period that unfortunately also coincided with the devastating spread of disease across Europe and Asia, dramatically reshaping populations and societies throughout the region. And as the world slowly recovered, a renewed spirit of art, science, and learning began emerging in Europe, further accelerated by the invention of an early printing press that made the spread of written knowledge faster and more widespread than ever before. And around this same period, several European kingdoms underwent significant religious and political transformations, with renewed nationalism, religious reform movements, and consolidation of power reshaping the continent. And it was around this time that European explorers began venturing across the oceans, eventually reaching lands in the Americas that were entirely unfamiliar to them, leading to profound and often tragic encounters with the diverse indigenous civilizations already living there, many of which had developed sophisticated societies, remarkable architecture, and rich cultural traditions long before European contact. And as trade expanded across the Atlantic, entirely new global economic systems began forming, connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas in ways that would permanently reshape world history, while religious tensions in Europe continued to grow, ultimately leading to major reform movements that reshaped the continent's spiritual landscape for generations. And as centuries passed, powerful new nations rose across Europe, each competing for influence, trade routes, and overseas territories, eventually setting the stage for dramatic political revolutions driven by growing public frustration over taxation and governance, sparking major transformations not only in Europe, but across the Americas as well, inspiring independence movements throughout Latin America. And around the same era, groundbreaking industrial innovations transformed how goods were produced and transported, fueling significant economic and social change across the globe. While major world powers expanded their influence into distant regions, forming vast colonial networks that reshaped political boundaries and cultural identities across multiple continents. And meanwhile, in South Asia, powerful regional states rose and eventually gave way to expanding foreign trading companies, gradually gaining significant control over the region's political and economic affairs, while in East Asia, growing international pressure and trade disputes led to significant political upheaval and reform. And elsewhere, large nations such as Russia continued expanding their territory dramatically, becoming one of the largest empires the world had ever known, while political and social tensions simmered beneath the surface, eventually contributing to major transformations both domestically and internationally, and around the same period. Deep internal divisions in the United States led to significant national conflict, ultimately resulting in major social and political change, while in Europe, several nations underwent significant unification movements, further intensifying international competition for influence and resources across Africa and beyond. A period marked by rapid territorial expansion, driven by evolving scientific theories, economic ambition, and political rivalry. Even as the incredible depth and richness of Africa's own historical civilizations, kingdoms, and cultural achievements often went unrecognized by outside observers at the time. And as global tensions and technological innovation continued accelerating rapidly, with groundbreaking advancements in communication, transportation, and military technology transforming everyday life, the world found itself standing on the edge of a dramatically new and interconnected era. One defined by extraordinary opportunity, rapid change, and the powerful lessons of everything that came before it, setting the stage for the next incredible chapter of world history still waiting to be explored. Because if you step back and look at everything we've covered so far, you start to notice something fascinating, which is that history rarely moves in a straight line. It moves more like a web. With civilizations rising in one corner of the world, while completely unrelated societies are rising somewhere else entirely, sometimes never even knowing the other exists, and yet somehow their inventions, their beliefs, and their conflicts eventually ripple outward and touch each other anyway, whether through trade caravans crossing deserts, sailors crossing oceans, or armies crossing mountain ranges. And what's even more remarkable is how many of the ideas born in these ancient societies are still shaping our lives today without most people even realizing it. The alphabet you're reading this sentence in traces its roots back to those early Phoenician traders who just wanted an easier way to keep track of their shipments. The calendar hanging on your wall traces back to a Roman leader trying to organize his empire more efficiently. And the very idea of writing laws down so that rulers can't just make things up as they go traces back to a king, standing in front of a stone pillar thousands of years ago insisting that fairness should be permanent. And it's easy to look at history as a list of names and dates to memorize for a test. But really it's a story about people just like us, trying to solve problems with the tools and knowledge available to them at the time. Sometimes succeeding brilliantly and creating ideas that outlive them by thousands of years, and sometimes failing badly and leaving behind lessons that later generations had to learn the hard way. And if there's one thread that ties all of these different empires, religions, and revolutions together, it's this constant human tendency to organize, to build, to question, to trade, and then eventually to rebuild again, over and over across every continent in every era, regardless of language or culture, because that pattern is simply part of what it means to be human. And once you start noticing that pattern, history stops feeling like a random pile of disconnected facts and starts feeling like a genuinely connected story. One giant thread running from ancient Mesopotamian priests staring up at the stars all the way to the screen you're reading this on right now. And that connection is exactly why studying history matters so much. Not because it's about memorizing old events, but because understanding how societies rose, adapted, and sometimes struggled gives us real insight into the challenges our own world is facing today, whether that's questions about leadership, technology, trade, identity, or simply how different groups of people can coexist peacefully. And the truth is, we are all still writing this same story, adding new chapters every single day, which means the choices being made right now by ordinary people just like you and me, will eventually become someone else's history lesson far in the future. So the next time you look at a map, a coin, a calendar, or even the alphabet itself, remember that every single one of those things carries a story stretching back thousands of years. shaped by countless civilizations who never could have imagined how far their ideas would eventually travel. And that's really the whole point of exploring world history in the first place. Not just to remember what happened, but to understand how everything connects, how every empire, invention, and idea builds on something that came before it, creating the incredible, complicated, endlessly fascinating world we all share today.